And while we're waiting for people in general to dial in, I just wanted to check in and see if various people want to speak today. Who wants to speak? Um, I think we're going to have Max is going to give us a little presentation about open source AI, so a bit of an Alibaba perspective.
Yes, I have prepared a couple of slides, very short presentation
That's
to trigger some discussion, to provide some input for our AI study group.
Now that is very exciting. All right.
Hey Shane, Brian and I will be presenting some slides on the ISO standard.
Understood. Understood. That is great. And I think we're going to have potentially some briefing from Matthew himself as well. I just saw an email from Matthew regarding the shared document, which was redlined some information, redlining some of the existing compliance spec work and having a look at what's fitting with what we're doing, what we're thinking about in AI, and of course, just as a thinking document to have a look at the ideas that were shared. Now,
Hi, Shane. I'm now
Hi.
online.
Wonderful. Matthew, I haven't had a chance to, I just saw your email right now with the shared document.
We don't need this now. We don't need
You
this
don't need
now.
it right now. Okay. So I'll process your email and have a look at that stuff while you start the meeting itself, and I'll hand over to you here.
Thanks, Shane. Please talk amongst yourselves. I just need to dial into the room myself so I can share the screen. We are first going to talk about ISO 4201, and then we are going to, there's kind of a few different areas to talk about this standard. So we've got a bit of an overview, and then I'm going to hand over to Brian and Jeff. We're going to carry on the conversation around this ISO standard 4201 and see if there are any gaps between this and ISO 5230, which is the OpenChain licensing standard. Just as I was dialing, I think Shane was talking about a shared document. If you recall from the last session we had, we took the ISO 5230 and kind of did some lines on it to say what we kind of want to include. And I think we're going to evolve that over the next session or so. So I now have my screen. Shane, would you just like to talk to our wonderful antitrust policy?
Yes, of course, my favorite part of the day. So the Linux Foundation, all of our calls, all of our meetings are held under the antitrust policy, and you can find the full antitrust policy on the Linux Foundation website. If you're from an LF member company, you're welcome to ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. In short, as with everything we do, we ensure that there's a safe, comfortable space for us to share information around open source technology and open sharing and open innovation in general. And with that, I have to let go of my favorite toy, return the slide deck to Matthew, and just report in, Matthew, I'll have that red line document. I'll put it in a shared folder as both PDF and a Word document for later, and I'll just put that in the chat just to let you know, for you not to interrupt your flow.
Thank you. So thanks for that, Shane. And one day I will learn Shane's spiel and be able to regurgitate it myself. Just to kind of clarify the agenda today, we've got ISO 4201, which is an AI related standard. Sandra here in Cambridge was just going to give an overview of that, then I'm going to hand over to Brian and Jeff to again carry on the conversation. This is all going to be more of a discussion rather than a lecture on 4201 and the gaps between that and our OpenChain standard. I just want to open it up to anyone else to ask if there's any further agenda items that we want to discuss today.
Yes, just flagging that Max from Alibaba wants to talk about open source AI.
Yes, thank you, Shane. I have raised my hand. That is, I have prepared a couple of slides to as the input for the AI study group, and hopefully to trigger some discussion regarding the open source AI model. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Max. I'll put you towards the end of the agenda, but I will save some time for that. And the representative from Fujitsu, we talked briefly. Do we want to carry on the conversation about copyright, or would you like to defer that for another session?
Oh, today there's nothing to add for today's meeting, and thank you for asking me.
Thank you, Saki-san. Great. Okay, well, let's start the agenda then. I'm going to hand over to Sandra to talk about ISO 4201, and this is an opportunity to have a bit of a discussion. Sandra.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I was trying to start the presentation by giving some details about this standard ISO 42001, which is the one on AI management system. And then I was trying to give an overview of the ISO framework for AI, and then we can open some topics for discussion also about this standard. So if it's okay for you, I'll start with this ISO 42001. And Matthew, can you? Thank you. So this standard is for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and improving an AI management system. Organizations can elect to apply the requirements in this standard through their selected risk-based approach to ensure that the appropriate level of control is applied for AI use cases, services, and products. In this context, control refers to measures that mitigate risk. It is important to note that the standard is not meant to assess the legality of AI systems against certain regulations, but instead it focuses on due diligence from a purely operational perspective. So it creates processes that allows the organization to measure compliance against the risk appetite. And in this sense, if we try to implement the standard, for example, within a conformity assessment scheme, we'll also be able to certify compliance for product-focused regulatory frameworks, like, for example, the one in Canada. So Annex A provides a list of controls that can be adopted by the organization throughout the AI lifecycle, and Annex B provides guidance toward the implementation of such controls. Overall speaking, this standard groups obligations according to three categories: organizational planning, implementation of controls, and document review and auditing. And for this reason, the standard also requires the organization to document and audit the AI management system and evaluate performance and conformity. So with this being said, we can go an overview of the framework for AI. Having this ISO standard as the parent standard, we note that there is a number of working groups that are very interesting also to look at. The first one is about foundational standards. It provides terminology, reference architectures, and frameworks for AI. The second is all about data and covers the standards related to data quality, management, and governance, which, as you know, is very important for models. Then we have a working group on trustworthiness, ensuring that AI systems are secure, reliable, and ethical. I think from these ones, there is a standard 23894, so the second one in the list. This is probably the most interesting standard to look along with the parent standards, because ISO 42 is based on the assumption that the company already has risk management processes in place. So in order to create an AI management systems, it goes through the current risk management system of the company and identify gaps. So if we read it along this standard, we will be able to create an adequate management system for organizations developing, implementing, and using AI systems. Then the next working group is about use cases and applications. I just wanted to note here that there is a withdrawal effective from last April. The next working group is about computational approaches and computational characteristics of AI systems, which covers methodologies, algorithms, and computational properties. Finally, we have a joint working group about establishing frameworks for AI governance and compliance with ethical guidelines and regulations. And I forgot to note it in these slides, but just to mention that there is a number of initiatives currently going on that are being developed on AI testing, functional safety, and also ISO 42006, which is meant to advance on certification programs for AI. So with this being said, I think we can open the field for discussion. We have noted a number of questions. Actually, one of them is also about open source. So we can start by reviewing the first one. After that, we'll go on mute. And if any of you wants to share anything, you're more than welcome to do so. So the first question is about, is there sufficient account for the need to manage and audit external dependencies? How can we solve potential blind spots in the auditing process when critical components and data come from third parties? Looking forward to your thoughts.
Anyone got any comments on this discussion point? And also, maybe just before we get to this specific one, have people, I mean, we mentioned ISO 42001 in previous meetings, but have other people had, are they aware of it as well? Have they come across this standard before?
Hey Shane, this is Jeff. Yeah, Brian and I work with 42001 quite a bit. And you know, our slides are kind of fleshing out some of the details of it in terms of kind of the different sections they potentially map to the OpenChain spec.
Thanks for that, Jeff. And you know, if there's no comments here on the discussion points, we can move on to your sort of more detailed slides.
I do think like these open discussion points are valuable and perhaps maybe can come after Brian and my presentation, because it kind of we might be able to kind of visualize perhaps where a conversation about dependencies.
Why don't we do that then? Why don't we'll put a pause on this open discussion, and I can hand over to you to share. I don't think you put the slides in the shared deck, but if you want to share your screen, Jeff, we can go from there.
Will do.
Thanks, Jeff. We can see your screen now, but I think you're muted.
I'll go and kick this off. Thanks for driving, Jeff. We can probably go past the antitrust since it was taken care of already, which is great. So this is Brian here. Just a couple high level comments before we dive in is appreciate that introduction to 42001. I think it's useful for this study group to look at that as an input into some of the perspectives of what may be relevant for an AI risk management system and the parallels to a supply chain processes and artifacts that have trust in the system. Sort of get a sense of what people are maybe already doing or people are expecting to see. I think it's important that we don't duplicate anything in there or make anything redundant. But at the same time, we try. I think it's important that we don't try to be adverse to it. I think we just sort of look at it as an input of many things. And our slides are sort of high level summaries. It's not not verbatim text from the standard, so I wouldn't take any of this information as as lifted from the standard. It's really just sort of high level talking points of here's some topics we should consider and see if we've got gaps or if we're already good to go. And please jump in with any comments or questions at any moment. This is meant to be a discussion. I'd love to talk less and listen more, but happy to talk as well if people are still trying to get up to speed here. Let's go ahead and jump on in, Jeff. So the way the standard is broken up to, there are, I believe, 10 sections. The first one is just introductory, so we're going to gloss over that. I'm going to speak to the first half of them, and Jeff will speak to the other half. Each section has the actual standard and introduction, and then, as was just discussed, there's an Annex A and Annex B, which are supplementary and complementary, providing really more actionable details of how you actually can satisfy the standard. So starting with section 2, it's really focused on policy. So this is something that we're all familiar with. I think I think we're already if we look at the OpenChain 5230, I think this is a vehicle that's already there. There's of course maybe different verbiage or expectations of the policy, but that as a concept is accounted for. One thing I want to point out here is that it is mentioned that the policy should be reviewed at planned intervals. So it's not a set it and forget it situation. It's to set it, assess how the business is doing, how the global regulations or other inputs are going, and reevaluate and reassess on some sort of regular cadence. And you could go ahead and tab, Jeff. So I think this one is, I think we're covered here. Maybe, looking for feedback on if we think the policy section is something that we're already accounting for. And in Annex B, we dive into a little bit more detail. It's talking about, how should this policy be informed? So you're looking at things like, how does your organization structure? What is your risk tolerance? What kinds of risks do your AI systems potentially have? What requirements, both internal and external, do you have? So do you have contractual obligations? Do you have regulatory obligations? Do you have shareholder obligations? Really, eyes wide open and considering all those factors. And I wanted to call out this one highlighted in blue. If you go back, Jeff, sorry. I think I'd love to hear folks that are familiar with the OpenChain standard. Any thoughts on this bullet, which is having a process in the policy that handles deviations and exceptions to the policy. So explicitly saying, yes, this is our policy, but we're aware that it may need to take a back seat to real world events.
And is that deviation just simply, an escalation path? Is that what you're thinking of here?
Yeah, it could be an escalation, or it could be, a disclaimer saying if certain events, occur, it is ironically within policy to not be within policy, if that makes sense. Just providing some wiggle room because you don't want to be, robotic in it. I think in the AI world, what people are very much concerned about is risk, and so if something unexpected pops up, it creates risk. You want to have the flexibility to account for it. I think
would we specify? Well, yeah. Can you think of an example as an exception here?
I can think of an analogy where something would be like there's a confidentiality provision amongst you and a professional providing services. Except if there is impending threat to life or well-being, then the confidentiality can be broken. So something in parallel to that, I think we will have to consider this if it makes sense. I think we'll have to come up with some language that's flexible. But again, this is just something for us to take into consideration.
And just be clear, that bottom paragraph, is from 4201, not like the previous slide is from 5230.
Correct. This is yeah. These are some summary bullets from 42001.
Thank you.
So section 3 talks primarily about the way things are organized internally. So you can see, the objective, at least out of Annex A, is to establish accountability within the organization and uphold this responsible approach for the implementation, operation, and management of the AI systems. I think this is another. Go ahead and click the next animation, Jeff. This is another one I think that the OpenChain 5230 already contemplates. So I think this is something that is not a gap currently. It's about showing that you've got internal organizations. Let's jump to the next slide. And Annex B kind of dives into a bit more granularity. And again, I think it's covered. We'll leave this on the screen for just a minute for folks to read. But it's about organizations should consider AI policies, AI objectives, and identify risks when assigning these roles, responsibilities, to make sure everything is covered.
I agree. I think that's very similar to, as you point out, something in 5230. We have this roles and responsibilities definition or clause.
Jeff, you could hit click. I see a comment here from. Sorry, one policy exception example could be from OSS licensing world. Policy says no AGPL license components except if approved and signed off by the CXO. Yeah, great example. So you can say policy is never do A, except if these a series of events happen, then A is permitted.
That's a good escalation exception, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Make sure that comment.
And again, we don't typically in OpenChain go into this much detail, but it's just highlighting that there can be exceptions. Is that your understanding, Jeff, Brian?
Yeah, I think this is just meant to inform what types of things companies might already be positioning to have implemented internally, and it would be nice to make sure we've got commonality here and no gaps. Yeah, none of this is meant to be strict requirements, and the granularity here is much deeper than I expect we'll end up with. So on this one, this talks about it's titled context of the organization, but really it's about kind of constantly managing the system, looking for the inputs, understanding the both external and internal inputs to your risk management. Interesting. This did call out about specifically about whether climate change is a relevant issue. So I don't know if that would be appropriate for an OpenChain standard, but I think it's just an interesting call out.
We've touched on this before, haven't we? And if you follow my logic, the climate change was related to the origin of where things are being run. And I want to say it was Jimmy or maybe someone else said, well, if it's in a country where there's lots of hydroelectricity or their energy is based on petroleum, that's where the origin comes in. And then where does this bit relate to the AI system? Well, we put that in an AI bill of materials, and that correlates to a software bill of materials for 5230.
Yeah.
That was just my logic?
I remember when we discussed this last time, a couple of months ago, someone else, don't remember the name, mentioned that the state of California considers sustainability as one of the requirements in the laws, the state laws. but I don't remember the person who made this comment.
I guess that's a couple of different points then that have been brought up on climate change.
It might be related to the very different power needs of these new models. Yeah, because training large language models is a lot more expensive in terms of power usage. So it makes a material difference.
Any other comments on this point from anyone else? Anything on the chat? I don't think there's anything on the chat.
Good.
I might comment though, just briefly about the California law. I think there's some generalized laws on the books. I don't know of one specific to AI that's in effect. There are a number of, there's like over 300 different AI related laws pending in various of the 50 states in the US. So it's kind of very messy as to how to predict where things are headed. But it might be sort of a pending thing if it's specific to AI in California. But those are all good points. Thanks.
And I guess one last point I should clarify is I think tying it to or comparing it to the OpenChain standard. You know, the OpenChain standard was talking more about license obligations as the primary input. You know, that's, you know, the compliance is surrounded by showing evidence of compliance, whereas this ISO 42001 brings in a whole host of other considerations. So it's a much more complicated bar for, I think, for companies to grapple with, because it's less apparent of what is needed. So something for us to kind of think about and acknowledge that companies will be grappling with this.
I have one quick comment to make here. I think when it comes to the 42001 standard, do we make or at least specific call outs around the training data set when it comes to specifying the underlying the AI systems? Are we going to, or is there a provision to call out the underlying training data set as well as the associated licenses pertaining to those? One of the reasons why I specifically ask is obviously in the case of closed AI systems, one may not get that information. So I'm just trying to understand how is that problem being addressed in this standard.
Yeah, so there is some discussion on data. We'll get into that. It's, you know, transparency is one of the driving forces here. But I think there's less emphasis on licenses for this AI standard, and I think that's maybe where OpenChain might be a nice place to have you know, an open source license focused set of artifacts and a AI risk management focus. You could kind of combine them. I think that's where OpenChain might fit in. So I think for the licensing side, we may want to lean more heavily on the OpenChain standard as opposed to these other ones, for understanding what makes sense to show a healthy supply chain and in confidence in the system.
Okay. So what, so maybe we can sort of marry the aspects of 5230 and try to bring the overall license compliance regulations. However, I mean, when it comes to the actual systems, right, that we are going to build potentially, like, or any organization that might be using it, there might be obviously challenges in terms of identifying or even having access to all the data sets. So is there a mandate that we wanted to specify, or at least the standard specifies that you have to have, minimal, you have to have a training data set visibility, or is that something that probably it leaves it up to the organizations to determine that?
For me, answering that question is why we've got this study group, and to have 20 different people on the call to debate, discuss what we want to try and capture, what we all think is reasonable. And I guess we'll see how that thread evolves over the coming months. But touching on your point on licensing, I agree that we have expertise on licensing from the 5230 on this call and elsewhere in the OpenChain membership. So having a main focus on licensing, I think, plays to our strengths. And there are several different points, in my opinion, and I'd love to hear others, of where licensing interacts with this new world of AI, whether it is the data set, the training stuff going into a model, or the model itself, and the testing data and any validation data. All these different points can have different licensing interactions, and we may want to flesh out the licensing part of a set of principles to cover different I guess types of projects or systems, whether it is an actual model or the different sets of data.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Dave. I think that the question that's being asked here is one of those critical questions that we do need to confront. I think we've heard a couple different views on this, and I think I want to read into your comment, Prasad, as a inclination to want to require disclosure of training data sets, for proprietary models as well. And it's a very deep and interesting question, because it gets into issues as to whether or not the regulatory frameworks currently support that, unambiguously. And the problem right now is, at least in the U.S., the issue of what are the boundaries of fair use is still unsettled, and it'll probably be unsettled for probably another couple of years. And so, excuse me. And so, the place that I think I want to land, so that OpenChain is going to be a standard that is most universally appropriate across various regions, is for us to say, certainly when you provide the model, you should provide all the compliance artifacts, which include the license itself, for the model. And then, based on what might be bilaterally arranged between any two, supplier or customer relationships, then, there should be the optionality for the additional information as to training data set licenses and other disclosures connected to those training data sets to be made available, but in a way that has some standardization connected to it, so that the efficiency of that transaction, if it were to be required as between two parties, would be enabled. That's sort of a tentative position of where I'm at, and I know that other folks on this call might have other views, but it's an interesting and very deep topic that I think we should maybe allocate some specific time at a future work team discussion to get into. But I just wanted to put that out there. I want to recognize that my position might be different than where I think that you were landing, and there may be other positions as well that other people could have.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, Dave. I think Yeah, I think what we are looking at least from my perspective, and you're right. I think trying to. It seems to me that what you just mentioned, you basically kind of sort of modularized or at least kind of what I'm hearing is the licensing aspect of the model, and then you separated that out from licensing of the underlying training data sets as additional accessory, if you will, to that overall compliance policy, right? So that's kind of where I think you're kind of trying to separate that out, which makes sense to a certain extent, and that also makes a way to better organize, especially within an organization when you are using an internal governance model for the approving let's say a given model. You may want to take that approach, but one of the challenges we kind of face is that we upfront know that there are certain models which are completely open source, and both the license itself of the model itself, as well as the training data set, they're all available under open source. Then there are some categories of models where you have the model is open source, but again, the training data set may or may not be all data open source. Some of them could be purchased, in which case it's pretty straightforward. It's commercial license. But in some cases, it's a combination of commercial and open source training data set. And then you have these closed models where the model as such is, again, commercial license. However, the underlying data set, it's a mystery. Nobody knows where it is. And, those organizations, obviously, they have closed models. So how do we accommodate all these various categories of AI models, using our, combination probably of 5230 and the, in association with maybe additional extension or the accessory that you just pointed out, that maybe we'll have to have a modularized way of representing licensing of the models and then the licensing of the training data set.
Yeah. I think that that would be an approach to consider. Sometimes, let me actually just pause, a second, because I'm about to get into this a little bit more deeply with you, and because to me it's some really great points. Let me check with Brian and Jeff. Is this a good point for us to have that conversation, or should we come back to it?
This has been an awesome exchange of ideas and comments. I think this is exactly what this slide deck is intended to sort of tease out. So like, for example, the data side, right? So the 42001 does state here, you need to document the information on the data resources, but it's a bit open-ended. So I think it's absolutely key that we flag these. I'd love to hear from the rest of the group about if we want to spend time now sort of detailing this conversation, or if we want to just earmark it, say this is going to be something we're going to have a nice discussion on at a later point. We've got plenty of time, but I don't know how many more of these we're going to identify today.
Certainly, this topic has come up a number of times over the last few months. I'm happy to do a deep dive now. I know Max wanted to touch on, I guess, similar topic as well. So let's spend time on
then I would suggest we come back after Max's talk.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. That way, folks on the call that maybe haven't had the opportunity to think deeply about this issue can spend some time knowing that it'll be a discussion point at an upcoming gathering.
Yeah, I agree. I think we can circle back on this. But yeah, as I think Dave pointed out, I think this is something that we all have been trying to get our heads wrapped around it. But yeah, there's a lot more brainstorming to be done here. But yeah, appreciate.
So
Yeah,
shall
thanks
we
for
finish
the
your slides,
thanks for
Jeff and
comments.
Brian?
Yes, one more just to take away for this is, so 5230 has this concept of having your compliance effectively resourced. In my read, it's more focused on personnel and maybe budget, if you will. ISO 42001 gets a lot more granular, talking about obviously data resources, but compute resources and tooling resources. So just something to throw out there. I think there is a gap here between the two, but I don't know how relevant it is, and that maybe something we could table for another day to talk about.
Yeah,
Let's
agreed.
move on.
What the other aspect that we just talked about, right? Like earlier about the models versus data sets. Also, this provides us an opportunity for us to potentially correlate the model and the data set related aspects to also organizations that have to at least if you want to regulate on, let's say, inventory management, right? So I'm talking about AI model inventory. So how do we model it, right? So maybe some sort of, without getting into patronizing one standard over other, but we can at least kind of specify or try to tend to say that maybe organizations that comply with ISO 5230 and will have to have some sort of a standardization of the model inventory data. And that could be, again, you can easily fit that information of the model and the training data set into the AI and data profiles that is part of the SPDX 3.0, which got released earlier this year, like in April. So that is something that, again, SPDX is obviously just one standard, but without, necessarily pushing for that standard, but we can at least kind of specify that organizations might want to think about modeling and essentially have ability to standardize the data aspects of both the model metadata as well as training data in some sort of a standardized way as part of the SBOM itself for every offer that is associated with the model. That is one point I just wanted to call out.
Appreciate that. Thank you. All right, Jeff, let's move on a little here. So this one, I think this maybe click one more, Jeff. I'll highlight what I think is interesting. So in section 5, they really talk about leadership accountability with oversight, sort of the buck stops here, and reporting up to leadership. And this is from my read, a novel concept compared to 5230. I'd love to open this up for a discussion as to whether this is a concept that would add value to a new AI data standard where companies would be passing along artifacts that suggest that top leadership is accountable and overseeing these risk profiles and these supply chain issues, or if this is too granular. But I think it's an interesting concept that sort of puts an accent on the internal processes, saying this is very, very important to get right.
So this section is just adding that extra layer, because we say early on, we say we should have a policy to set purposes and objectives, but Now this is saying top management are accountable for that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's saying that this doesn't just exist, but it's of top priority, that there is accountability at the highest levels.
And I agree. I don't think the words top management are in 5230, but isn't there the concept of roles and responsibilities defined in 5230, which is tangentially linked to this top management concept?
I think it's just, to me, it was just the explicitness that they call this out. It was intriguing. Not saying that it's something we, we would certainly want to mimic, but I just wanted to get some feedback from folks if this is as interesting as I found it to be.
And I would imagine a lot of this is inferred anyway. Surely top management of a company are ultimately responsible or accountable for, an area like a policy. I also find it fascinating that they've called it out. What was the thoughts behind this? Any other comments?
This is Jimmy Albert from Ericsson speaking. I'd just like to make the comment that is top management then defined? I don't mind having it explicitly called out. Frankly, I think it's good to create that explicit ownership and accountability, at least sort of from within my own organization. I think that's something that would help. But I don't know if it helps unless you actually define what we mean with top management. If you're in a fairly large organization, as many of the companies represented on this call, you are sort of riddled with management from sort of a relatively low level up until the very top of the totem pole with CEO. So the question is, which of those are considered top management? And is it only the top management of the company, or is it enough that some top management is accountable for it?
Maybe just a note to what Jimmy was saying, that if we think about ISO 5230, there's the scope, and then the scope could be, even project could be the scope. Then the top management could be whoever manages that project. But then if we think about the whole organization or company, then I don't know, should it be like CEO or like CXO level top management?
Yeah, I
So
think
depending on the scope, the top management is different. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. I think, in my opinion, yeah, I I agree. I think the top management potentially is like more like a placeholder. And it obviously, depending on the organization, it can potentially take various forms. Certain organizations, it could be that there is an internal AI governance body, and that could take that place. Or in other cases where, let's say, that the overall AI, let's say a model inventory model exists, and that model inventory is operating based on certain standard. It could be a standard like SPDX, which obviously has the ability to granularize data as SBOMs. So whoever is the owner of that SBOM from the engineering, or that owning business unit, could be that top management. So it kind of varies from how we want to look at it. So I agree with, I think, what was just mentioned. I think top management being more like a placeholder, but we can leave that up to the individual organizations to determine what that really means in their respective organizations. But key thing is, I think, emphasizing the need for some single central body to be responsible and essentially take ownership of this policies and follow through and governance. I think that's something that we can specify and emphasize on.
Yeah, thanks for that discussion. So I think it's something we can consider. How specific or vague we don't want to be, or whether it makes sense to have a similar concept. Yeah, great discussion. Thank you, Jeff. Let's jump to the next slide. So this is also in section 5. It has a slightly different title in the annex, but this is about assessing the the risk and the impacts of the AI systems, which results in documentation of those of the impacts to individuals or societies. What I wanted to call out here is there's a focus on doing this activity throughout the life cycle of the AI system. So it's not like I try to draw a comparison to the build of materials. So on the licensing side, it's sort of a get it right, be compliant, and then you can sort of move on to the next activity. I think there is, whereas the AI system impact assessment needs to continue throughout the life cycle. And I think a nice analogy would be maybe security vulnerability monitoring of a package. So I'm curious if folks have any thoughts about the way that security vulnerabilities find themselves into an SBOM and are reported out, and if we could find some parallels to this notion of impact assessments. Question one, is it something that would be important to pass along as an artifact? And two, what's the mechanism for keeping it updated?
At the moment, there are already, as far as I'm aware, some processes for reporting security vulnerabilities within a specific timeline that we are operating towards. And I think that needs to be respected already. The existing process needs to be respected. I don't know if we need to necessarily diverge from that.
Yeah, I think that's a great vehicle. So I think to the extent these impact assessments are appropriate for an OpenChain artifact, that I think it seems to me that we do have there's some path forward there that already exists on the security vulnerability side. And as we mentioned at the top of the meeting, this 42001 is quite granular. So a lot of these concepts may or may not be appropriate for an OpenChain standard if we're trying to find that harmonization between the current 5230 and what the AI may look like. And then the last section I'm going to go over here is it's really on planning. It's very long, and it's about the organizations being able to take a holistic macro view of the objectives of the system, the potentials of the consequences to the organization, consequences to individuals, like the last section do, impact assessments, likelihood of these risks occurring, the potential gravity of those risks if they were to materialize, and then the organization being able to take a high level big picture prioritization of, okay, this is where we need to focus our energy, and this is the most important one to address. And these all need to be documented and consistent with the policy and be measurable. be communicated out. So this it kind of falls back to the policy idea of having it be well thought through, accessible to people internally, to a certain extent accessible to external folks. And that's something I just want to call out here is I think comparing it to the ISO 5230, where in my read, you have more objective compliance concerns coming from licenses, whereas this ISO 42001, it's more subjective. So you've got, a squishy concept like risk, and then you've got a spectrum of the likelihood of it occurring, and then you have on the flip side the risk appetite of the company or the entity, and then you've got all these external factors. And so I don't, I want to open up the dialogue to this group saying, how comfortable are we including or discussing these more subjective points in a standard potentially, as opposed to more objective criteria that you can check off and say yes or no, as opposed to, well, we thought about it and it's complicated.
The way I'd approach that is start with those points, and if we like that in the first version and we feel as though we can go into more detail, then we could work towards that later on. But as you point out, we tend to go for that high level, have you thought about risk? Yes, tick, move on.
Mm-hmm.
Then we could say, if we wanted to evolve that, well, what is it that you're looking for with risk? Is it licensing or compliance or whatever? We could go down to that more granular detail if we thought there was appetite for it.
Right, so if I can jump through these last two slides real quickly. These are the going over at a high level again. These are very long, very dense sections. The Annex A and Annex B in support of Section 6. And these are, management guidance for the AI system developments. And I think this is something that is largely covered, or at the very least contemplated by 5230 on the alignment, with the awareness section. It's about, again, taking a high level approach, eyes wide open, and communicating out to the rest of the company. Maybe jump to the next and my last slide, Jeff. And so these are some of the document. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is highlights of what, at least in the eyes of 42001, needs to be documented within an organization for these AI risk management systems. So you need to have the objectives. You need to have processes for the responsible design and development and deployment of the AI system. You need to have the system design and development, then what types of verification and validation measures. So that's like testing, technical documentation, record keeping of event logs. And so I think one of the themes here to take away is there is an ongoing expectation that these systems are being monitored, and that information is informing updates and further communications. And I know I brought this up previously, but for an OpenChain standard, I think another big thing we need to talk about is what's the appetite or expectation for providing, say, an AI bomb once and that being sufficient, or what obligations, if any, persist during a product lifecycle? What's the expected cadence of updates? And as we mentioned, I think security vulnerabilities is a great vehicle and launching pad for us to look for guidance on what the industry would expect to see and appreciate. Any thoughts?
I have one just comment here. I think it's great to see, all of these various aspects covered. One potential aspects to consider is training, right? The amount of or is the organization has any relevant internal, it could be internal, like, a formal internal training program that, might involve understanding on AI models and obviously Gen AI in particular, and also having that training program maybe have like, multiple courses that are part of that program, and what is the criteria, right, for the various organizational members, internal members, to take that program. Obviously, the actual intensity of the program could be tiered, and different functional roles within the organization can take a different level of intensity of the program. But in general, at a high level, again, that can be determined by the individual organizational leadership. But having the aspect of like, hey, there is an internal AI training program, and is this something that the organization has to have? I'm just trying to get everyone thoughts on having that potentially even as an additional aspect to cover.
Yeah,
Hey, this is
I would absolutely agree with that.
I was going to say it's actually a perfect segue, Brian, because the next section is support, which deals with resources and competence and awareness and the like. So I think it touches on a lot of those needs.
Excellent. Well, I will jump on mute here and hand it over to Jeff.
All right. So continuing on here, we're moving to section 7, which is broadly defined as support. It's pretty broad in its requirements. So, for example, the first one is 7.1 is about providing the resources needed, and of course, it's like a broad requirement here, like for establishment, implementation, maintenance, continual improvement. The second one is largely about competence of people interacting with and developing and making sure that there's appropriate procedures, documentation surrounding that. The third, I think, which perhaps touches to what was just brought up, is awareness of all the policy and systems surrounding it, and perhaps, as it states here, implications of nonconformance and what that means for the individuals or business units. And the kind of 7.4 was touches on how they actually internally and externally communicate to partners. And this is more just processing in general, or high level, what, when, with whom, and how. So once again, kind of documenting processes here. So there's obviously a lot of parallel to the OpenChain spec. As I noted here, there's effectively resourced, competence, even a section on awareness that we can kind of draw direct parallels to. Communication, there's not a direct one. The policy does reference communication method, but we could potentially expand that.
Yeah, I think probably I agree. I think the training that I brought up earlier, I think probably will come into that 3.1.3 awareness aspect to it. But we are just trying to, probably the specific tiering and those things, I think we can just leave it up to the organizations on how they want to accommodate that training program.
Great. 7.5 is broadly kind of introducing the idea of kind of documentation here. So the first section is generally requiring documentation, and it kind of refers generally to the standard itself and the requirements within and for the effectiveness of the larger system. It includes talking points such as how to create an update, how the documentation is controlled, including security considerations, storage preservation, kind of iterative controls, iterative changes and how those are noted, retention, disposition, and the like. So, and I think this possibly touches on whether we need to kind of add a section generally on documentation, and perhaps the conversation about data pedigree falls into this documentation section. But as far as what I could see, the policy generally requires a documented policy, but the ISO spec definitely has extensive information, especially in the annexes of topics that could be considered or should be required in these documents. Section 8 generally is about operation, and I think we're going to see some kind of cross references to what Brian talked about, as you kind of see here with Section 6, which was the last section he noted. But once again, it's kind of high level, making sure that there's processes that are implemented and how they are controlled to meet the requirements of the management system, the AI management system, those related to kind of risk that was determined previously, assessments and plans, impact assessments that was talked about. Once again, we kind of have a general reference to documentation being required, but perhaps these are larger kind of sub-points in that. As Brian mentioned, we don't want to kind of reinvent the wheel or state everything that potentially would be required, but perhaps these are kind of the summaries of potential operational related needs that need to be addressed. Similarly, moving on to 9, this is generally labeled performance evaluation. And as expected, you're basically analyzing and evaluating your kind of operational procedures, including audits and review. Stemming from, I would imagine, the performance evaluations is the need to how to kind of accommodate for and processes surrounding improvement of the system itself. Similar kind of to what we talked about a couple slides ago, how to recognize nonconformance and what the actions surrounding that would be. But generally kind of following in this kind of flow of developing processes, how to evaluate those processes, and how to improve upon them depending on the results of the evaluation. In the corresponding kind of sections 7 through 10 in the annexes, I kind of just wanted to illustrate the detail they're talking about, and I think this touches on a little bit about the data conversation and data pedigree. These are generally phrased, I think, as shalls, and they're also non-exclusive. So it's not everything that one might want to consider, but I wanted to kind of reproduce this as what they're considering to be appropriate. So section 7, A7 is talking about data and AI. So generally, A7, the first one is about management processes, defining, documenting, and implementing the processes surrounding data used as development and for AI management systems. Similarly, it kind of then breaks down into these other categories: acquisition, quality, provenance, preparation, determining and documenting the details about these different categories, the different requirements surrounding these different topics. I don't think I need to read through it, but I imagine these are all kind of questions when we think about data pedigree and ingestion of data sets. A lot of regulatory and legal requirements are asking entities to look at in some form. Once again, yep.
If you don't mind, I'd pick up on the word bias there. That, I guess, is that defined, or are some of these terms defined of what they are looking for saying something isn't biased?
I don't recall a definition. I'd have to kind of look through it. Looking at Annex B, where it talks about it, it once again should consider the impact of bias, but I don't believe there's a actual definition of it.
And then maybe a question to others is there a legal definition of the word bias? I just pick up on this point just because if we say exactly those words, Jeff, that you call out, how does a company say that the model or whatever isn't biased or has been reviewed for bias?
Right.
Don't know.
And I feel like one of the limitations of perhaps reading these ISO standards, as was presented before Brian took over, was, an ISO standard references another ISO standard, which references another. And do we want to follow that model or actually make it a little bit more functional for the reader?
I'd ideally like to make it functional. I guess where I'm going here is if we use the word, secure or safe or bias, we either define that or we help companies understand what they would need to do to reach that level. I can just see sort of concerns with ambiguity over things like those type of words. I guess it's finding that fine line, isn't it, between being very general and saying, have you reviewed this for bias? And then going into more detail of what that is looking for.
Yeah, I think that aspect, Matthew is absolutely right. I think it most likely will end up getting driven by the respective organization. If they have an internal governance body, like an AI governance body, they might come up with a set of criteria. This is around, potentially it could be n number of factors that they may come up with and saying, hey, is our policy checking all these boxes? And those boxes could be based on those individual organizations' policy, the respective organizations' policies, what they are trying to promote.
Agreed. And Sandra's just showed me in the room that this word bias is referenced to another ISO standard, reference to another one, and they have actually defined it.
Yes, I'm putting the link in the chat.
Okay. I just picked up on the word bias there as just one of those many in the parentheses on the screen. But it's a good point of do we leave it down to the organization, or do we direct people to other advice on how they can look up what bias looks like?
Now, so on the bias topic, I think the most interesting discussion point that I'm getting out of this is the concept of bias doesn't exist in the current OpenChain standard for open source. Is this something that we think is valuable to include in some manner, or is this something that goes beyond what we see for an AI standard? I mean, I know bias is front and center in a lot of the regulations and a lot of the internal principles at various companies for responsible AI. So I think it's hard to ignore, but I agree that it's not a black and white easy issue.
And Brian, Jeff, I don't know if you've seen that ISO standard has just been put in the chat. There is a whole ISO standard on bias in AI systems. So we can either defer to that.
Oh, great.
Great. Where am I? Okay, so section 8, this is largely kind of a transparency / providing information to parties outside of the entity as needed. So, and I actually, let me clarify that. I don't think it's specific to external here. It could be, they just call it quote unquote relevant interested parties. So this includes, as it's stated here, the information that allows an interested party to assess risk and impacts. So in doing so, it's a system documentation, means to which communicate with external groups about adverse impacts of the AI system, ability to report to users, and I should say, I believe this is about reporting back, but actually maybe it's both ways. Incident reporting regarding use of the system, and obligations generally to these interested parties regarding use of the system. And at some point, and I think it was in Annex B, they reference relevant authorities as a potential interested party. So there's the access section in the OpenChain spec, and I feel like this maps pretty well to some of this. Perhaps we could, if interested in expanding how to communicate with third parties, and obviously there's also a parallel to documentation here, but something to consider if we want to elaborate on that. Moving on to section 9, this is a little bit similar to the conversation we were having about training and access. So a parallel there. This is about assurance. How does an organization assure that the AI system is used according to its policy and corresponding limitations and permissions, and also that it's responsibly used. So it's kind of dual here. And so this includes, once again, documentation, what these things are, responsible use, and related objectives to kind of guide that responsible use. And similarly, policies surrounding how to actually ensure that it's being used according to these accepted intended uses. So we're in the annex now, and this is, as Brian said, controls, suggested controls to kind of meet the larger points. So obviously this maps to what we were just talking about a while ago, is defining policies, how to monitor, test, and then improve based on those things, the audit steps that we discussed. And finally, this one's touching on, and this is an interesting section, understanding obligations and accountability to third parties, including apportioning risk. And so this first one is actually specific to how responsibilities within the larger AI system lifecycle are allocated between organizations, partners, suppliers, and third parties. Similarly, in the second one, it's processes to ensure that the materials and services align with the requirements of those suppliers, and kind of at the opposite end of that life cycle, that consumer expectations are met when developing and using these products. I believe, yep, that's all I got.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Brian, for going through that. And again, very good to link to what we have. I think it's been a very good and open discussion. We can touch on the next agenda item with Max around open source compliance around AI, unless there's any other questions or comments on the work there from Jeff and Brian.
I just encourage folks to think about, this standard is primarily focused around risk management systems. And I'd love for folks to think about to what extent does risk management belong in an artifact in the supply chain? We're of course going to be touching on the licensing of the models. We've got an open discussion pending on the data sets, but how much or little do we want to include this risk management attestations in an artifact? I think it brings a new perspective to what the current standard is.
I think it would be really important to be able to link it coherently to the risk management frameworks that are emerging, because all of the legislation, well, the EU and the US legislation definitely seems to be based on a risk management basis. So it would be really helpful for 5230 to be able to map, not reinvent, but explain how those risk management frameworks map into the supply chain.
Thanks, Stephen. Any other comments? Hearing none, can we hand over to Max? Max was going to talk about open source AI, the difference between open source software and a model. And then after this, we can have a conversation and then maybe bring that back to a wider conversation about open source AI work. Max, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So basically, this is, I think, is mostly to raise some requirements regarding the open source AI model instead of talking about solutions. So as mentioned earlier, I think the purpose here is to trigger discussions here in the OpenChain AI study group and possibly to give some input for the discussions here. Okay, so the first page, as shown in the screen, is talking about the differences between the open source software and open source AI model. So the differences is actually from we can divide the differences from different perspectives. For example, from the components perspective, the open source software mainly for many components is the source code itself, but the open source AI model, it have much more things. For example, the parameters, the weights, and the source code, dataset, algorithm, and also may including the information, non-technical information, for example, the model card and much more things, for example, the deployment tools, etc. So basically, it has many more components compared to the open source software. And from the deployment perspective, the cost is relatively low for the open source software, and the cost is relatively low if one developer wants to further development based on an open source software. But for the open source AI model, the cost is much higher, both for deployment and for the further development. For example, for the fine tuning for the open source AI model, it requires a lot of computing power and other resources. And from the license perspective, normally the open source software has the license. There is no restrictions for commercial use. But for open source AI model, they may have restrictions. And from the research and development cost perspective, for the open source software, the research and development costs can be spread out by the open source community developers, because those developers can co-work together to develop our open source software. But the open source AI model is very hard for the open source community to train the model, because the training and deployment cost is very high. So this page actually gives some background and comparison between the open source software and open source AI model. It's not complete, but I think it's a start point to trigger some discussion here. And following that, we can also have a picture to discuss the open source model ecosystem. Basically, there are three aspects that is important for open source AI model. The first one is a component, as discussed earlier. Basically, the components means that what is the AI model? It may include the technical components, for example, the source code itself, the training data, algorithm, etc., and also include non-technical component, for example, the model card, dataset sheet, and training logs, etc. And they may have other components that is important for the usage of the AI model, for example, the lessons and other documentation. That is the first part. The second part is the tools. Basically, it is useful to answer the question how to use the model. For example, the deployment framework, the deployment guidance, and the fine-tuning methods, etc. The last part is the risk management, how to access the security risk, what is the security risk assessment framework, and what is the tools, and the security assessment data set, and the guidance for responsible usage, etc. So again, this is not a complete list. It just gives some example to trigger the discussion. Basically, to think about what aspects of open source AI model should consider. And the next page is some open questions and haven't been answered and addressed, I think, by the open source industry that is in the open source supply chain and open source AI model ecosystem, there are different roles. For example, in this the left part of the figure, there is open source model service platform. For example, Hugging Face and other services. As for Alibaba Cloud, we also have our own open source AI model service platform. So on top of that, the platform can have different open source model AI models, and the users, the developers, can use this open source AI model to build their applications. They can also fine-tuning their own model based on the open source AI model provided by the open source model service platform. So that is basically have some potential problem and issues. For example, from the risk perspective, there may be different aspects of the risk sources. For example, there could be issues inherent in the open source model itself, and there may be some risks that caused by the improper fine-tuning methods, and could be caused by improper fine-tuning data, and maybe there are other reasons that can introduce risks during this process. From the solutions perspective, I just list a very simple starting point to trigger discussions. Again, it's not actually it's not a proposal. It's a very simple starting point to let the group, to gather the interest of the group. Possibly, if there is some interest in the OpenChain AI study group, maybe that is a potential direction. We should put some resources to developing the solutions around that. So here I just need a very simple starting point of the solution for example, to provide the open source enough open source information. Most of them are about the model transparency. It's has some similarity as the model card idea, but it's more focused on the open source model card. For example, it could include the model's intended functionality, the dataset information, the model limitations, and the known issues, etc. And also we can another approach is to develop some lessons framework that suitable for the open source AI model. It may need some extensions based on current open source licenses, but to deal with the open source AI models potential issues, especially for the different responsibilities of different roles as shown in the left part of this figure. Okay, that is a very simple presentation. I think that is all I have. Is there any comments or feedbacks?
Thanks, Max, for presenting that. I think you raised some good points and possible solutions. I'm happy to open it up for discussion. Max, what are your thoughts on this? Maybe you could expand on the possible solution. I mean, certainly what you've got in that box there, I guess has been brought up in previous calls around having intended functionality, listing data sets out, possibly listing the license. These are the sort of things you're looking for and wanting to expand on those solutions?
Yes, that is what I'm currently thinking about. Because I think that is pretty much very useful if, for example, if OpenChain project can give some guidance for the open source AI model industry, that would be very useful to, for example, to let the open source model service platform or other players in this ecosystem to improve the quality of their services and to have their very clear responsibilities regarding the risk responsibilities and other things. So I think that is really needed to be addressed, because that is have some urgent need for the open source AI model industry.
Yeah. Yeah, if I can just come in there, Max. Yeah, hi, Stephen Pollard from Orkro. Yeah, Max. I mean, what you described there is something that we're seeing. A number of people are like wrestling with right now across the board. And you say there's quite an urgent need.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing people focusing really hard on that on that model card, especially in the in the compliance side of things, wanting to get a grip on effectively on the pedigree of models that are being actively used across the board in large development teams. Yeah, everything you're describing there, looks like a really good basis to go. What we're seeing is, I don't know what your situation is, but we're seeing organizations wanting to focus on, especially if they're developing their own AI models, an inner sourcing kind of technique to sort of improve practices and processes, and then to find a way to begin to open up and connect to the open source model world. But there's a lot of confusion out there as to what really is open source, and how much of a model is open or not. So yeah, it's a large and really complex area for a lot of people right now.
Yes. Thank you for the comments.
Hey Max, Dave Marr here. I feel like the presentation you gave I think it's excellent. I feel like it's intended to craft some issues around the scenario of open source model input and then open source model output. In other words, if one were to take an open source model and then consume it and then of course further train it and enhance it, and then have output of that, not as output of the model, but the model itself is the output. So you have a proprietary model that now you're potentially selling commercially. I feel like that doesn't fit as squarely, but if you're talking about sort of like a model that is developed in the open and and you want other people to further develop it, then I think all these things are important. In fact, fundamentally important to have. And I don't want to discount other people's views that in the proprietary space, these also might be equally important. But I see this as more central to open source. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I think that is a good comments. Actually, for the open source AI model ecosystem, it is important to, for example, to have different responsibilities for different roles. I think that is my very initial idea here, at least here. I think you also covered some part of that. But of course, it's a very complex problem, but it's an urgent industry need. So actually for today's meeting, because time is limited, I think my goal here is to to really to see whether there is enough interest in this group to further to go deep research on this direction. If that is the case, I can work together with this group and make more research and provide more information on that direction. Then we can corroborate and potentially to develop solutions to address this kind of issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. Just responding to that, I think, well, speaking personally, I think I have interest, and maybe others do as well. I think you're onto an interesting train of thought on this. I like the way that you frame these risk sources on this slide. Because when you start talking about things like how do you debias a model, how do you I shouldn't say debias, bias mitigate a model. How do you address for, privacy enhanced frameworks? All those require subdisciplines that are, as you put it, role-based. And it gets to some of the issues that I think Prasad and I were talking about earlier as to disclosure of data sets and the intentions around what that might serve. So I think this is a good framework for us to further iterate on.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan.
Yeah, I agree. I think is definitely an interesting area to explore, and especially this kind of also a very good similarity of how we handle open source dependencies, open source components in the realm of software development, and trying to correlate that with the open source AI models usage. Could be a really interesting exploration. I think with open source AI models, obviously there are challenges primarily for those, for large organizations. I think there is definitely some of the challenges and risks that you called out totally makes sense. I think doing more research in this area and then trying to come up with other potential solutions, I think could be really helpful. And also potentially pave the way for greater adoption, right? For open source models as opposed to closed models. That's another, I think, positive outcome that might come out of this.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for the comments.
I have a question, Max, regarding to the original question. Rather than opting for one solution or the other, will it be feasible to go for the two of them at the same time? Like, will it be any scenario where a license could be conflicting with an AI bomb? Do you think?
Yeah, I think the tools is also very, very useful. That is, will help us to actually implement the standard or guidance developed by the OpenChain project. I think that is indeed a very interesting points we should consider.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the comments.
Anything else for Max? Okay. Given the time, it's probably best, unless others agree, to not open up the conversation about whether we want to focus on open source or proprietary models. But I'm open to discussion if people want to spend a few minutes talking about it now, but maybe we could defer it and have it as a larger topic for next time. Maybe we can all take that away with us to think about and review, bring certain points to the table next time.
Yeah, I agree with that, Matthew. It's a good deep topic for us to next time if we only have 15 minutes left.
I don't want to get in now and have to abruptly stop. So if we're kind of all in agreement that we can defer that to the next meeting, Max, Brian, and Jeff, I don't know if you're able to share the slides with myself and Shane, and we can capture this as part of the distribution of the minutes and comments. We've also got another session on Thursday morning, the Europe-Asia session. I'm happy to present on behalf of Jeff and Brian the audio of what we've just gone through. Max, I don't know where you are located and if you wanted to join that session, or I can discuss the points on your behalf.
I think I can join that. I'm based in Beijing, China.
Wow, well, it must be very late for you. Appreciate you dialing in and having a very good conversation there. If you are able to present on Thursday, that would be great. Does anyone else have any other comments or any other business?
I just wanted to jump in and say that I think it's great so much ground is being covered. And this is an extraordinarily difficult topic because it's so new. However, the fact that this study group exists has been receiving positive feedback. I was in Shenzhen on Friday. There was an OpenChain workshop in collaboration with Huawei and SecTrend. And we had an audience of about 40 people. And they were very interested in the fact there was this space to try and find commonalities on the topic of AI compliance in the supply chain. I just had an event in Taipei. It was a mixture of smaller and larger companies and people working on policy matters and so on. Again, a very positive response. The same has been true in many different cities, many different regions, many different countries as I've gone around. So what we do here, while we're trying to grapple with difficult concepts to get these commonalities, is resonating. And I just wanted to let people know that this 2-hour commitment to talking through things is being influential and helping people see that there's a space that they can either attend this call or they can look at the recordings and try and narrow down this field. So I just wanted to let you know that it's having far more impact than just this workshop, just these 2 hours, just this group.
That's great to hear, Shane. Thanks for that feedback. Really appreciate it. Great. Well, if there's no other business, I propose that we close the call and we'll meet again in a month's time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was great.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.